Hi students, welcome to REL 205, week 5. We're headed into the final stretch. I have some things I want to share with you about my trip to Cuba, but in the meanwhile, I want to get this uploaded. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the final paper or project, whichever you choose to do. I wanted to let you know that I am going to post a note with my phone number and contact information, because if you would like to call me and spend 10-15 minutes talking about paper ideas, I'm happy to be a sounding board. And I think for some people maybe that's an easier format. So I want to make myself available to you in that way. I also wanted to add something that I've been thinking about for additional topics, one of which is the World Cup. I thought, World Cup is kind of this global ritual of where people come together, families gather. My own spouse is in Costa Rica right now with his family, connecting with them, something they do as a family. When I lived in Indonesia, there were 19 of us living in a guest house, and we were from all over the world. And people used to wake up at 2 in the morning to turn on the TV because some team was playing and another team, and people would get up and make food, and it was really celebratory. And so I wanted to offer that as a possible backdrop for a paper or project. I thought that might be of interest to maybe one of you, I don't know. And then on a less celebratory note, I thought also about the way mass shootings have come to have this whole ritual that we do in response. So there's something that happens in the immediate aftermath in terms of coverage, and then there are things that happen on social media responses. There's a polarization. And then there's a performance of mourning, and I thought that could be of interest to someone that wants to do more of a social critique, but within the confines of our course materials, and connecting to our course materials. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit. That's final paper project information, and you and I can talk personally about your paper or project if you want to. We'll schedule a time. Okay, and then the readings. First of all, the poetry. So we're reading from 2 books this week. We are finished with The Death of Ivan Ilyich and Other Stories, although I would argue that you can go back many times and reread these pieces by Tolstoy, and that you will find something new each time, because you will be new, and so the reading will be new. You'll bring your most recent experiences to those readings. Good book to hold on to. But from Wild Poets of Ecstasy, we're in the last pieces of that, and there are both Inuit songs, and remember, we're reading them as prose, but they would have been performed. They were something we would listen to more as music. And the Teton Sioux poetry, the sun dance, beautiful stuff connecting to nature. Gerard Manley Hopkins poetry, you're going to find sumptuous language and imagery in those poems. Some people love it, and other people are kind of turned off by it. It's over the top for them. Just depends where you fall. Be reading again, Negro spirituals, which would be would be sung, and you can look up a couple of them on YouTube so you can hear them being performed, and think about the way those themes are drawn and used in contemporary music performances. Those are songs of pain. You can think also of another, Rivers of Babylon isn't in there, or songs about Babylon, but the way that's used in Rasta. That was a topic that we returned to in this conference I was just participating in. So a lot about the natural world, sexual and spiritual ecstasy. Sometimes we're not even sure which we're talking about, both. And Tagore, famous poet of India, from the work Gitanjal. That's very sensual and beautiful. So that's from Wild Poets of Ecstasy, if you choose to write on that. And then from Death, Mourning, and Burial, we are going to be thinking through lots of ways to understand death and how we process mourning. So the first, chapter 4, Philip Aries, I jotted this down. From the earliest times, man, and let's include women in there, human beings have refused to accept either sex or death as crude facts of nature. What does he mean by that? So we have to set up these rituals and performances that we do to incorporate this crude, natural piece of the life cycle into our consciousness. So he talks about the taming of death, or a tame death, death of the self, privacy towards, death becomes, death becomes more private after a certain point. What changes about that, from moving from a communal event to a very private event. Now I will say about his piece, keep an eye out, because it's pretty Eurocentric. So it doesn't, it doesn't map across the globe, right? And it doesn't map across, he's trying to say, okay, this is what happens over time. This is how it moves. But he's only talking about specific spaces. I would argue more urban spaces than rural spaces, and more Western European and US, North America spaces than maybe other parts of the world. So think about that. Then Locke's chapter compares US and Japanese approaches to defining the end of life. It's brain death, the end of life. And then looking at that as a way to understand how we make these rules about when it's okay to harvest organs, so how does organ donation and transplant rely on particular definitions of when someone is actually dead and when those organs can be harvested. Now, he's writing in a very specific time space. This stuff has changed so rapidly that some of this will be dated. So as with anything we read, it's researched and written in a certain time space. So think of it as a little time capsule. It captures a particular moment in time in a particular place, and it's already changed, for sure. It's already moved on. We're things are constantly moving, right? We can't step into the same river twice. Well, that's true in any of these ethnographic readings. Places change, and sometimes they change really quickly, and technology changes really quickly. So and I wanted to say that also in terms of Nancy Shepherd Hughes's piece, that we should remember Brazil is a huge country, and she was talking about a very discrete community. She was talking about a particular class of women, families that were really poor. She was trying to critique economic conditions that contributed to the poverty. So we cannot say, oh, this is all of Brazil. This is certainly not. This is all classes. No, certainly not. This is all of Latin America. Big mistake to say this is the way we in the U.S. Well, we're a complex culture too, right? The United States has all different kinds. We're made up of, peoples who come from all over the world. So there is no discrete way to say this is how we understand infant loss in the United States. And because you're imposing a particular frame, you're probably coming out of, your own experience, own consciousness, own social setting, your own class, your own level of education, economic conditions, your religious background. This is not to critique what any of you wrote. It's just to say, let's be thinking about those things, all of us, as we go forward. but there are also stable elements that transcend. So even though, as I've just said, this stuff happens in a time space that's very particular, we are reading precisely these poems, these short stories, and notes from Tolstoy, and these ethnographic pieces, because there's something in them that transcends their immediate setting. So we want to think about, what is it? What am I asking you to think about, when you read those pieces? What is it that transcends? Okay. And then the piece by Catedra, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but she's writing about the vaqueros, which are they're nomadic cowherds. This is northern Spain. These are people of the mountains, and she's talking about the way they classify. They have 3 classifications for death, roughly, she found. She's also interested because they have a high rate of suicide, and a high rate of suicide among young women. So what's that about? Why is that happening? And one of the things I found interesting in that is that they talked about, in their culture, I would argue in many cultures, we are children twice. We are children when we are born and growing up, but then at the end of life, if we're lucky to live a long, full life, that at the end of life, we may not be our healthiest. We might be more fragile in many ways, economically precarious. Maybe we're not working anymore, and don't have, social resilience. We're relying a lot on family. We might be, not as mobile, and we might take on different roles within our families. She talks about that. So, and then the last piece, we're also going to read Death and Headhunter's Rage. And I posted another piece that you can read in conjunction with that by Rosalind Morris, which is The War Drive. And I think those pieces have a lot that fit together. So some of you might be interested in taking a look at that. I will post more later, but I think I'm going to time out on this lecture. So I'm going to get this uploaded, and then I will be in touch. Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.